Okay, hello. My name is Chris Reynolds. I'm the Historic Buildings Officer for the county. In the previous regeneration, I was Martin Higgins. Martin's now retired, so I've taken over his role. I worked with Martin for about 3 years. I know it's rather big shoes to fill, but I promise I will do my best. What I'm really here to do today is just to explain, there we are, just to explain exactly what I do as part of my role, to explain a bit more about different categories of built heritage assets. And it's something which Rob has touched on, it's something Tony touched on right at the start. And I'm going to talk a bit about understanding how you can protect historic buildings as well. I'm not going to go into as much detail as Nick or Rob have done, so I'll be relatively quick if that's all right. And if there are any questions in the future, by all means do get in touch with me. I have a slightly odd role within the Surrey County Council Historic Environment Planning team. As Nick mentioned earlier on, we provide archaeological advice across the whole county, but we don't provide historic building advice across the whole county. I comment on planning and listed building consent applications for Surrey County Council and Tandridge District Council. I do not do them for the other 10 boroughs and districts. I do want to emphasise that because I've spotted one of my fellow conservation officers is on this call somewhere. So just to make sure that you know that I've made that clear. The reason for that is it is very unhelpful for me to step on the toes of other officers who have their own work to do, their own remit, and that's how it's been set up. So each authority has their own conservation officer. The only reason it's different for Tandridge is because they essentially would act as a consultant to Tandridge as their conservation officer. That includes things like commenting on the physical impact on listed buildings or old buildings, or the indirect impact on them through things like the impact on their setting. And I'll talk a bit more about that later on. As Tony mentioned earlier on, I advise Surrey County Council on its own historic buildings. We've got a rather nice example here. This is a staircase in the mansion in Leatherhead. I think it's grade 2 listed, 18th century Georgian house. And while looking there the other day, it measures to upgrade the thermal performance of the building in line with the climate crisis that we've declared. Found this rather lovely staircase where the stairs underneath fold out from the stairs at the top, which I was quite surprised by. And it did look like they were all genuinely authentic, which I thought was a rather nice surprise. So as part of my role, I advise the county on how they should be looking after their own buildings, and making sure they don't do anything inappropriate with them. I sometimes carry out projects on behalf of the team. It depends on my capacity. But what I'm most proud of at the moment is I managed to get £70,000 off the government for funding the local list review, which you're going to hear from Charlotte about shortly. And it's rather difficult to get money off the government sometimes, so I thought that was quite a big achievement. But I also provide advice to the Surrey Historic Buildings Trust, and I know that there are some members of the trust here today. If you don't know what the Surrey Historic Buildings Trust is, it is a charity set up in 1980 with £25,000 from a former sheriff of the county. And that money was matched by Surrey County Council, and for a while they gave money towards the trust. And the primary purpose of the trust is to preserve for the benefit of the public the historic, architectural and constructional heritage that may exist in Surrey. And that includes a whole range of activities. Historically, we've bought, restored and sold buildings, and including Chatley Heath Semaphore Tower, which I think now is in the hands of the Landmark Trust. But unfortunately, it's rather expensive to do that these days because Surrey historic buildings are rather pricey, so we haven't done that in quite a while. We promote awareness of historic buildings across Surrey. This includes getting news articles published, giving presentations to local groups, and also visiting historic sites. And the example here, we've got a lovely photograph of, might look a bit like we're doing a sort of ABBA reunion or something. It was actually a COVID secure visit to Brookwood Cemetery, because we were rather keen to make sure that none of us were going to be permanent residents there as a result of the visit. So we all made sure we were spaced out properly, meeting all the rules. But visits are one of the many things we do. We also host the Surrey Heritage Awards, which I'm sure you're all very eagerly waiting for the result of at the end of March. And this year's winner was the Horton Chapel, which we're going on a visit to tomorrow, which was restored recently. Finally, the Trust offers small grants for the repair of historic buildings. It varies a bit. In the past, we've given out around £20,000 a year. It depends on the type of projects that come up, and primarily for repairing historic buildings. But in some cases, we also looked at reinstating historic features. The website for the trust is at the bottom there in case anyone is interested. We do have a working group, and we're always looking for more people who may be interested in trying to encourage the preservation and conservation of Surrey's excellent built heritage. This is an example of a project which the trust funded. This is a barn belonging to the Orpheus Centre in Bletchley. This is a barn which helps a local charity that help people with special educational needs do various art type things. The roof of the barn is in a pretty poor condition. You can see it's thatched, so it needed patching and repairing and a new ridge installing. So the Buildings Trust offered a grant of £3,000, 20% of the project's cost, and that's the result there, which I think looks rather nice. It isn't just a subject of my excellent photography skills. So that's roughly what I do. This barn is Grade 2 listed, which means it is something which is called a designated heritage asset. And my colleague Rob touched on this earlier on. I'm just going to go quickly through what is a designated heritage asset. In essence, it is a heritage asset which is designated under either relevant legislation or international charters. So that might include World Heritage Sites, scheduled monuments, listed buildings, protected rec sites, registered parks and gardens, registered battlefields, or conservation areas. They have to be listed under some form of legislation to be considered a designated heritage asset. If a heritage asset is not protected by legislation or listed under legislation, that's the reason I'm making that distinction, it is considered undesignated or not designated. And I'll talk a little bit about that later on. So what kind of designated heritage assets do we have in Surrey? Well, we don't have any protected recs because we're not on the coast. We don't, unfortunately, have any World Heritage Sites because UNESCO clearly haven't appreciated our excellent history. We don't have any registered battlefields, but we do have these 4 wonderful categories of designated heritage assets in the county. That includes scheduled monuments, registered parks and gardens, listed buildings and conservation areas. And the reason that I've got this fantastic photograph here, which is of the Belvedere at Claremont, is because it's a scheduled monument. It's a listed building and it's also in a registered park and garden. Ticks 3 of the 4 designated heritage assets in the county. I'm just going to have a quick look now and go through roughly what that means for each of those designations. And I will keep this quick. Scheduled monuments, Tony mentioned these right at the start. These are nationally important archaeological sites, and that includes not just what's above ground, but what's below ground as well. And they're designated under the Ancient Monuments and Archaeological Areas Act of 1979. However, some buildings have mysteriously crept in there as the scheduling was one of the very early forms of protection for old things or old buildings in the county. So we do have some assets like the Belvedere, which are both scheduled and listed. It's all rather complicated, but that is the most basic way I can describe it. I'm sure the other conservation officer who's listening to this will have a better, more detailed description, but that is roughly how it works. The example here is the old cage in Lingfield. It's an 18th century prison, if I remember rightly, sort of holding cell, but it also has St. Peter's cross adjoined to it. Historic England must be consulted on works which affect scheduled monuments. That's the key thing. So if you've got something that involves a scheduled monument, I will normally tell you, almost always tell you to go and speak to Historic England. We then have registered parks and gardens, and they're a rather funny one, really. Registered parks and gardens started to be registered as a result of the National Heritage Act of 1983, which meant that they could then be compiled as part of the Historic Buildings and Ancient Monuments Act of 1953. It's all very complicated. They weren't designated from the off. It can include gardens, grounds, town squares, or cemeteries. An example here is Brookwood Cemetery. Brookwood Cemetery, of course, is both a registered park and garden and a conservation area, and contains a number of listed buildings. Works to registered parks and gardens do not require any form of additional consent. It may need planning permission, but there is no listed garden consent. And there's no plan to add that as far as I'm aware at the moment. But often they do require planning permission. A rather interesting oddity about parks and gardens that I mentioned, hinted at earlier on, is technically there is no statutory provisions to protect parks and gardens. It's all contained within national planning policy and local planning policy. That is on the verge of changing. There was a policy and a legislative change announced in the Queen's Speech whereby parks and gardens would be protected under legislation. In reality, it doesn't really make a lot of difference, but it is a slight oddity in terms of how we look after various different types of heritage assets. More easy to understand are listed buildings. Many of you will, of course, know what listed buildings are. They are listed under the Planning Listed Buildings and Conservation Areas Act of 1990. They are designated by Historic England, not by local authorities. So if you want to have a building listed, you have to go to Historic England. And it can include a wide variety of types of structure. The picture I've got here, of course, many of you will recognise as the old County Hall in Kingston, now grade 2-star listed. Of course, we used to be based there. Works which affect the special interest of the building require listed building consent. If you are not sure if something requires listed building consent, by all means do speak to your local conservation officer and they will be able to advise you. I cannot advise you if it's in one of the other 10 boroughs and districts in the county because it's not under my remit. Sometimes you may have something like replacing a carpet, which is not an interesting carpet that wouldn't require listed building consent. Sometimes you might have some rather uninteresting kitchen appliances inserted in the 1970s. And of course, they're also not a special architectural historic interest. But when you come to things like changing the layout of buildings or taking off something that genuinely is of special interest, then it requires listed building consent. Any questions, strongly suggest you speak to your local conservation officer. I mentioned it can include a wide variety of types of structure. Here are a few rather interesting ones. The one on the left is the Bent Memorial in Brookwood. As you can see, not perhaps in the best condition after suffering a fire, I believe, in the late 20th century, but it is still listed. Top right, we have a milestone in Godstone, set out as part of the turnpikes. And the bottom right, many of you will be looking at thinking, heavens, that ghastly concrete block, surely that can't be grade 2 listed, but it is. That is the grade 2 listed Woking electricity control room. And the reason it's listed is the interior of it looks like this. Built by ASEAN, I think in 1936, it might be 32, apologies for the date wrong on that. It was built for the Southern Railway in order to provide power to the third rail system, and is a fascinating part of our railway heritage across the country, and I think it's rather nice inside. I think if I remember rightly, the uplighters actually aren't original, but they've been very nicely inserted. Currently not used today, but it is open on Heritage Open Days, so I would strongly urge you to go down to York Way and perhaps book a visit or however they plan it and take a visit there, because it is absolutely wonderful. And the gentlemen who run the visit are incredibly knowledgeable about how electricity works and railways. Not my area of expertise, I'm afraid. Finally, we have conservation areas. Again, they are designated under the Planning Listed Buildings and Conservation Areas Act of 1990. Compared to all the other designated heritage assets we've looked at before, these ones are slightly different because they are in fact designated by local authorities. They do get referred to the Secretary of State, who has the right to overrule new conservation areas, but they are slightly unusual in that they're decided by local authorities. Not everything can be a conservation area. It has to be an area of special historic or architectural interest, the character and appearance of which it is desirable to preserve and enhance. I tend to use the example of a buried Roman villa. It might be of immense historic interest, but if you can't see any of it, does it really have a character or appearance which is desirable to preserve and enhance? The example here is Limpsfield High Street, and it's something we've recently been producing a conservation area appraisal of, and clearly you can see from that it's got a wonderful character and appearance worthy of preservation and enhancing, and a rather wonderful conservation area. I mentioned that those are the designated heritage assets. We also have non-designated or undesignated heritage assets, which are a rather complicated area of heritage heritage planning policy and guidance. So I'm going to explain this as simply as possible, and then Charlotte is going to talk about it a bit later on. Non-designated heritage assets are heritage assets that are not designated, and that seems a really obvious thing to say. They're not protected under any legislation. Non-designated heritage assets are identified in the planning policy guidance as buildings, monuments, sites, places, area or landscapes identified by plan-making bodies, and you'll see that I've highlighted that, as having a degree of heritage significance meriting consideration in planning decisions, but which do not meet the criteria for designated heritage assets. The key thing with this is to understand that not everything is an undesignated heritage asset. It has to be identified in some way by a plan making body, that is a local authority, for it to be considered a non-designated heritage asset. Historic England, there was a discussion about this recently, made very clear that just because something is included in the Historic Environment record does not mean that it is a non-designated heritage asset. It is a specific planning consideration for assessment. So that's the key thing. It has to be identified by a plan-making body, and I'll talk about that in a second. In theory, it can be anything, but it has to meet the criteria set out by a local authority, and it sort of has to have some physical existence. It can't be a concept or a ghost. It has to be something that physically exists. So how non-designated heritage assets are identified? Well, Historic England Advice Note 7 notes that planning judgments can be made through various processes. These are the 5 which they list. First of all, you can have local heritage lists, list of locally listed buildings, sometimes they're called. Sometimes they're just called list of non-designated heritage assets. This is a project which we're working with 6 boroughs and districts on at the moment to review, and that's something which Charlotte is going to talk about more in a second. You can identify local as non-designated heritage assets through local plans, and that's indeed where many of our archaeological non-designated heritage assets are identified, the AHAPs and SyAS that Tony mentioned earlier on. Neighbourhood plans can, in theory, identify them. I tend to find it easier if they're in local heritage lists, from my own point of view, as you can do in conservation area appraisals and reviews. The final way in which you can identify non-designated heritage assets is decision-making on planning applications. So let's say, for example, something of important, or something that's identified as a heritage asset is going to be demolished as a result of a planning application. As part of that, a local authority can decide that it should be considered a non-designated heritage asset. The planning policy guidance in this notes that irrespective of how they are identified, it is important that the decisions to identify them as non-designated heritage assets are based on sound evidence. And many of you may recognise the building in the background, which I always get the name of it wrong. I believe it's the Heights in Hazelmere by Herbert Hutchinson. Quite a lot of H's there. This was not on a local heritage list, not on a neighbourhood plan or a local plan or in a conservation area appraisal, from what I'm aware. And it came up for demolition. There was a proposal to demolish it, and Waverley put a lot of time and effort into researching it, making it clear that they considered it to be a non-designated heritage asset. Disappointingly, the planning inspector disagreed. He said he didn't think it was very good, and that was essentially his conclusion. And as a result, he didn't consider that there was any grounds for retaining this building. It would have perhaps had stronger weight if it had been in one of the previous documents. So ensuring that things are identified as early on in the planning process is really, really very helpful. Charlotte is going to talk more about non-designated heritage assets in a second. I don't want to go too long about them because they are slightly complicated, and I hope that's given you a broad introduction on them. I now got some tips on protecting historic buildings because I thought that might be something of interest to the Archaeological Society. And the reason I wanted to include this is because I wanted to start with this photograph, which is Treetops in Artington, just near Guildford. And this was a building which is listed and is part of the development side, but it was actually sort of under threat in 2019 because the developer tried to get it delisted on the basis they didn't think it was very significant. In this instance, what happened is members of the Surrey Archaeological Society got together and researched the building to identify why it was significant and worthy of retention. They produced a very good report on that, including a lot of good quality research. That went to Historic England, and the decision was made to keep it listed. I have no doubt in my mind that if the other decision had been made, this building would have gone. So it goes to show that it is worth doing it, but the key thing is doing good quality research and putting that together. If you are concerned about a building which is under threat, there's a number of things which you can do. In the first case, try to get it listed. Anyone in theory can apply to Historic England to have a building listed. They will normally only assess applications if they're urgent. For example, if there's a current planning application submitted. The case on the right is a fascinating one, which I don't know if the owners are here today. They could be, which was we found during works to the other side of this wall. This wall is in Bletchley Place. It forms part of, I think we call it a small, it was either a Tudor palace or a Tudor house on a palatial scale. There's a bit of a debate over exactly what it was. All the different parts of this site are listed except this one. And this is a genuine 17th century wall which formed part of a courtyard or perhaps part of a building all around the site. It was an astonishing survival that had been covered up by trees historically. So when Historic England had come around to do the listing of the site previously, it had been missed off. Now, in defence of Historic England, this was in the middle of COVID, but I asked them to list it as it was urgent because there was a planning application in, and it still took them a year. So the sooner you can get stuff in when there's a threat to it, the better, and the more you can emphasise the urgency of it, the better as well. Historic England will consider the historical architectural interest of the structure or significance, look at its age and its completeness. And they will assess that against listing selection guides, which they have, as well as the guidance they have from what was DCMS. It's probably got a different name now. It might be DCMS, I can't quite remember. But they will make a decision on the basis of that. The key thing is to submit detailed research. I showed lots of historic maps when I submitted this one to Historic England and provided all the resources that I could to show what the site was. The more you can provide to them, the better. If you just submit the name of the building and say it's probably from the 1890s, you're going to struggle. The more detail you can put in, the better. However, it is a high bar for listing. It has to be of national significance to be included. And not everything is going to be meet that high bar. So there are a number of other things you can do as well. First of all, commenting on planning or listed building consent, planning applications or listed building consents will raise awareness to the local authority. The photograph there is of a bar in Warlingham, and this was one where the local residents made clear that the bar was actually far older than we initially thought. Could go back to the 1840s. There's more of it going to the left, which you can't see in the photograph. And the decision was made to keep that as it was an important part of the layout of the bar. It was essentially identified as being regional significance by the campaign for Real Ale, who also do a lot of work on heritage pubs. If the building is not listed, you can ask for it to be considered a non-designated heritage asset, but you must provide good evidence to support your claim, and ultimately the judgment on that will be up to the conservation officer. Sometimes things turn up unexpectedly. Sometimes lists are incredibly up to date, and it's unlikely that it would be considered. But the more information you can provide, the better. Refer to local and national policy, always very helpful. And being clear and polite in your comments is also really helpful, so the officer knows clearly what you are asking. Submitting very long, detailed comments that don't that it's not quite clear what you're asking can be unhelpful, and making it clear what you want is really very useful. Raising awareness is great. Contacting campaigning groups is always useful. Speaking to your local councillor is helpful, and also raising cases of local press. This is one that's been in the local press recently, which is the Debenhams building in Staines. This is part of a campaign by Save Britain's Heritage to protect our department stores. And my understanding is from the local press that an application for 2 tower blocks on this site was refused the other day on the basis that the local authority have decided that this is a non-designated heritage asset, and I believe they're also currently consulting on whether to include it within the conservation area. You can ask for conditions. Normally, a local authority will suggest conditions. That might include making sure they get the roof tiles right, for example, or ensuring the windows are set the correct level, the correct way from the edge of the building. But also something quite interesting like this. And this was a condition. This was used to outweigh harm to a listed building, where it was agreed to insert some ironstone paving out the front. This is freshly laid ironstone paving, laid in sharp sand. And ironstone paving is, I think, a big concern for Surrey as an area, and it's something we really need to do more to protect. And I'm hoping at some point I can finally get around to getting a long-term project going on it. I know a lot of other conservation officers are very keen on ironstone paving being retained as well. If you do have any ironstone paving in your garden, please, please, please do not lay it in mortar. It's totally inappropriate. It should just be sharp sand laid tightly, as in this example here. And it is a very distinctive material. Finally, you can also suggest that building recording work should be carried out where there is an impact on heritage assets. There is a requirement under paragraph 205 of the NPPF to record historic buildings. Recording levels can be set as per Historic England's understanding historic buildings, and that can include drawings, photographs, or research to be submitted to the HR. It is important that must be proportionate to what is happening to the building and also necessary. In this case, this was a building that was going to be insulated externally. It was a set of stables, and the framing was I don't think the frame was not going to be visible. I can't remember the exact ins and outs, but as part of it, a record was made of the framing of it to understand the construction of the building, and this formed part of the building recording here. I hope that's of interest. Lovely picture.